Hello Divination and welcome. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to beautifully showcase services on mobile devices with Divi. But before we get started, let me show you what we're about to design. So this is the final result. So as you can see, this is a beautiful layout. So this is what I'll be showing you today. So without wasting a lot of time, let's dive in and let's get started. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to design this from scratch. So I'm going to come over here to dashboard and then I am going to add a brand new page. So I'm just going to call this new design and then I'm going to go ahead and click on use Divi Builder. So for this design, we're going to build from scratch. So I'm going to click here on start building and then I'm just going to close this for now. So the very first thing we need to do here is to add the background shape. So I'm going to come over here to my section settings and then click on background. Now this is going to be a gradient, so I'm going to click on the second tab and click this plus button. So I'm going to paste my first color in here, and my second color here is going to be a transparent color. So I'm going to start adding my white here and then drag the slider all the way down. So this will give us full transparency. Now the next thing we need to do here is, because we are looking for a circular shape, so we need to change our gradient type here from linear to radial. Next, for our gradient direction, we need to set this to the left. And then finally, to get our shape, we need to adjust the start and end position. So over here, we're going to set this to 20% and end position to 20%. Now it's time to add our rows. So I'm going to go ahead and save here, click this plus button, and we're going to add a row with a single column. Now in that row, we are going to add a text module. So I'm just going to search for it and then I'm going to select it. So the first thing we're going to add here is just 01 for our services. So the text here is just going to be 01, and then we're going to come over here to the design text. Now it's time to customize this text. So the first thing we're going to do is to change our text font and set it to Poppins. For our font weight, we're going to set this to heavy, and then our color here is going to be white. And for our text size, we're going to set this to 20 VW. Next, on the line height, by default, it's set to 1.7, so we're going to set this to 1 EM. Now let's add the shadows. So over here on the text shadow, we're going to go with this option here. So I'm going to select it. And for our colors, I'm going to add a custom color. We're not going to use the default one that comes with Divi. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color between the brackets, just like that. Next, we're going to make sure that our text orientation is set to centered, because we really want this design to be right in the middle there. All right, so now that we have this, now the next stage is to add the second module. Now, before I do that, I'd like to remind you that if you want to use the exact same colors, the fonts and everything, all that will be linked into the post, which I'll add to in the show notes below. All right, so let's go ahead and save here, and let's add the second text module here. So I'm just going to use a shortcut, Shift space, and then I'm just going to search for text, and then I'm going to click insert text module. Right, so this is just a quick way of adding modules using this shortcut. So I'm going to go ahead now and add my text module. So all we have to do here is to type in services. I'm going to highlight this and set this to heading 2. Now let's customize this font. So we're going to come over here to the design tab, make sure we go to the H2 tab, and then we're going to change the font here to Poppins, and also we're going to make this font weight bold. So I'm going to select bold, and now it's time to add our colors. So for our text color, I'm going to set it to black, and then I'm going to set my color for this font as well, and it's going to be 10 VW. Now it's always good rule of thumb that as you're adding these values, you might as well go in and add them to the tablet and the phone as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So for all these three screen sizes, it's going to be the same value. Okay. Right. So moving on, what we're going to do next is to go to spacing. So over here on the spacing, this will allow us to add some spacing, some margins to the top and the bottom and so on. So I'm going to click here on spacing. And the first thing we're going to do is to add a margin of -8 to the top. Now this is on the desktop version. Now let's go into our tablet. So for the tablet, we're going to set this to -10, and for the phone, this needs to be set to -12. Now over here, just make sure that it's set to VW. So I'm just going to double check here and make sure everything is set to VW. Okay, so that's looking great. Oh, in fact, I need to set it to VW on the desktop as well. Okay, great. So all that's set now. The next thing we need to do is to add a second row and add 2 columns in that. So we're going to save this, and then we're going to click here on this plus button, add our 2 columns. Now, before we do anything here, let's go in and add our background colors for the columns. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon, click on background. So again, we're going to use the gradient. So I'm going to click this plus button, add my first color here. Now, as we did before for the second color, this is going to be a transparent color. So I'm going to click here on white and then drag the slider all the way down to the bottom. Right, so as we did before, this is also going to be a radial, and the direction this time is going to be right instead of center. So I'm going to come over here, select right, and our start and end position also needs to be adjusted. Let's add 30% here and 30% for the end position. Now, the next stage is to make sure that this row is set to full width. So let's come over here to design, sizing. So here on the max width, we're going to set this to 100%. Next, on the use custom gutter width, we need to set this to 1. So I'm going to drag this all the way to 1. Now, the reason why we're doing this is because we don't want any spaces between the columns. Okay, so that's why we're adding this 1. Now it's time to add our left and right padding. So I'm going to come over here to spacing. So this is going to be 15 VW, and this is going to be applied both to the left and the right. So that's why I clicked on this chain icon. Now for the tablet and the smartphone, we need to add 0 VW. So I'm just going to hover over this area here and click on this mobile icon, and then add my values like that. I'm going to do the same to the phone. Great. So far everything is in place. Now the next thing we're going to do is we need to make sure that these columns are next to each other. So to do that, we have a piece of CSS code or CSS snippet that we're going to add to this row. So I'm going to click here on advanced custom CSS, and on the main elements we're going to add this display flex. Now, as I mentioned, if you want to just copy this, it's going to be in the post, which I'll link to in the show notes below. Right, so what we're going to do next now is to add another text module. So I'm going to save this, click on this plus button, and search for my text module. I'm going to select it. Right, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to call this service 3. And below that, we're just going to add some text which says learn more. So here we're going to highlight learn more, and we're just going to make sure that this is a link, because in the real world this is going to link to a services page. So I've just added a blank link over here, and if you want, you can open this in a new tab as well, and then I'm just going to click on OK. Now on the service 3 here, the service 3 needs to be added as a heading. So I'm going to set this to a heading 3. Now, before we can go to and customize the text, let's add a background color to our text module. So I'm going to come over here to background, click this plus button. Now, the color I'm going to add here has transparency. So I'm just going to drag the slider down a little bit and then paste my values between the brackets, just like that. Right now, we can't see it because it has a bit of transparency, but you will see it as we continue with the design. So now let's go in and make our adjustments. So I'm going to click here on design. Text. So the first thing here is to make sure our text orientation is set to centered. So I'm going to select that. Now, in order for us to make changes to this text here we've just linked, or we just added a link to, we need to make sure that we click this brush tool. So this will take us exactly to this tab here. So this is the tab that we need. If you don't select this tab, you'll find it very difficult to make customizations to that link. All right, so let's start with the font. So the font here is going to be Poppins. And then over here on the font weight, we're going to set this to bold, underline. And finally, our text color here is going to be black. Now, we also need to set our underline color here as black, as well as the text color. So the text color here, we're going to set it to black. So now, as you can see, it's all black. Now it's time to add our sizes. So by default, it's 14 pixels. So we're going to set this to 1 VW. So that's going to be for the desktop. Now let's add sizes for the tablet and the phone. So I'm going to click here on this little icon. So for the tablet, we're going to set this to 2 VW. Now let's head over to the phone, and on the phone, it's going to be 3 VW. Now it's time to make customizations to our heading tab, our heading text. So I'm going to click here on this little brush tool. So that again is going to take us directly to heading 3. So just click in here and change the font here to Poppins. Next, we're going to come over here to our heading font weight, and we're going to set this to ultralight. And our color here again is going to be black, just to make sure everything is blending in very well. Now let's add the sizes. So for the desktop, it's going to be 2VW. So I'm just going to enter 2VW here. Click on this little icon and let's head over and add our sizes for the tablet and also for the phone. Okay, so I'm going to click here on the tablet, and for the tablet, this is going to be 3VW. And for the phone, we're going to set this to 4VW. Now we're going to come over here to the line height and we're going to set this to 1.9 EM. Now let's head over to the spacing because we need to add some margins both to the left and the right. So I'm going to click here on spacing and I'm going to start here with the left margin, set this to 5VW. And for the right margin, we're going to set this to minus 5VW. So make sure you add the minus there. So this just adjusts the positioning. So as you can see, this has now moved slightly towards the right. Now let's add our top padding. So here we're going to start with the desktop. So I'm going to come over here, add my top padding, and it's going to be 15VW, and the bottom is going to be also 15. So I'm just going to click this change so my value can be applied to both the top and the bottom. Next, I'm going to click here on this little icon, click on the tablet, and then I'm going to add my value for the tablet. So for the tablet, it's going to be 20, and this is going to be applied both to the top and the bottom as well. And then I'm going to move over to the phone, and for the phone, we're going to set this to 17. And as I mentioned before, it's always good practice to add the values for the tablets and the phone as you're building your website. Okay, so now that I've entered everything here, the next stage is to just add a border. Right, so to do that, we're just going to scroll down a little bit, click on border. Now over here on the top, we're going to set this to 100VW. And as you add these values, make sure that this chain icon is activated because this allows us to add all the values to all the 4 sides. All right, so next we're going to add a box shadow. So we're going to scroll down here, click on box shadow. And the option we're going to go with is with the first one here. So as you can see here, our shape has now been developed. Now I'm going to add my blur strength and set it to 100 pixels. So I'm going to come over here, look for my blur strength and set it to 100 pixels. So what it does is it just softens the blur. And then the next stage is to add our color. So I'm going to scroll down here to my shadow color and paste the values between the brackets. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to use the exact same values as I'm using throughout this tutorial, I will link to the post in the show notes below. All right, so now that we have all this is looking great. I'm going to go ahead and save. Right, so our design is now complete. So let's go ahead and save this. So what we're going to do next now is to clone this 4 times. So I'm going to click here on this clone button. Okay, and then the next thing we need to do is just to drag these into position. So the first one here is going to be dragged to the second column, just like that. Now we need one just below this one here in the second column. So let's go ahead and drag this one more time. Okay, so now we have these ones side by side. So the next thing we're going to do is to reposition these. So we're going to start off with this one here on the right. So let's go into the module settings. I'm going to click here on this gear icon and then I'm going to click on design spacing. Now, this is where we're going to make all our major changes just to make sure that these are positioned in the right place. So let's start with our top margin. So our top margin here is going to be set to 20VW. So I'm going to come over here, set my margin. And then for our left margin here, we're going to set it to minus 5VW. So what that does is it just moves this over here closer to the left. So let's add our minus. So as you can see, it's moved. But then again, we want to maintain that circle. So we're going to remove the minus on the right padding, on the right margin. So now you can see we've maintained that circle. Right, so now that we have it in place, let's go ahead and save. Now, the next thing we're going to do is to go on to the third one here and click again on the gear icon. So the first thing we're going to do here is to change the background color. So I'm going to click here on this color area and paste my color. Now, this is also going to be an RGBA value. So I'm going to place my values between the brackets. So as you can see, this has just been updated. All right. So the next thing we're going to do now is to modify the spacing settings too, but this time you're just going to move it slightly up, and it's going to be a negative margin. So I'm going to click here on design spacing. So for our negative margin here is going to be -5 VW. So as you can see, it's moved slightly over there to the top. All right, great. So moving on, let's work on the third item. So I'm going to save this, and then we're going to come over here, click on this gear icon. So the first thing we're going to do here is to change our color as well. I'm going to paste my color here between the brackets. And again, this needs some positioning. So let's click here on the design tab, spacing. So we are going to start with the top margin. So here again, it's going to be -5 VW because we want to move this slightly up. So I'm going to add my 5 VW. And then we also need to move this slightly to the left. So let's add our -VW, 5 VW. So as you can see, this moves slightly to the left, but as we did before, we still have the problem there because we have the negative margin there on the right. So let's get rid of that. And now we have our perfect circle. So now it's time to save. And then finally over here as well, we need to move this up slightly. So I'm going to click here on this gear icon, design, spacing, and let's add our -5 VW. Okay, and now that is in position. So that's how you move these circles closer together in this kind of manner. So pretty much that's all we need to do. I'm going to go ahead and save here. Now let's take a look at this in the mobile view. So I'm going to click here on expand settings, click on the tablet. So as you can see here, this looks beautiful on the tablet. And we are also going to click here on the phone view. And again, it looks really, really nice on these devices. Okay, so it's time now to work on our second design. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, click on a regular section, single column, and in that column, we are going to add a text module. So I'm going to search for it and select it. So I'm just going to get rid of all this text here and just call this services. Highlight the text, set it to heading 2. Now let's go to the heading 2 text settings to make some customizations to it. So I'm going to click here on design, heading text, heading 2. Right, so first of all, let's start with the font. So we're going to change this to Poppins. Next, we're going to make sure that this is aligned center. Now we're going to add the color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and add my color. Now this is going to be a gray, a dark gray. So I've just added my values there. Now it's time to add our sizes. So let's start with the desktop here since we're on the desktop view. Okay, so we're going to set this to 4 VW. Now let's click on this little icon here and add our values for the phone and the tablet. Right, so for the phone and the tablet, it's going to be 7 VW. So I'm just going to make sure I enter it in here and make sure this is set to 7. So I'm going to copy this and then just add it to the tablet. Okay, so that's looking great. I'm going to save this. Now, the next thing I'm going to do now is to add my divider module. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, click this plus button, search for my divider module, and select it. Click on design. Back over here, just make sure that show divider is set to yes, because if you don't, the divider will not show. But in this case, we want our divider to show. So I'm going to go ahead and click on design. Now let's customize this. So firstly, I'm going to add my color, and our color here is going to be the same as our heading 2 text. So I'm going to click here, click on the eyedropper tool and paste my dark gray in here. And then we are going to also work on the sizing. So the divider height, divider weight here is going to be 5 pixels. So we're going to come over here to sizing, set this to 5. Our width here is going to be 12%. And let's make sure that this is aligned center. So this row is mainly for our title. So let's go ahead and save. Now we also need to add our second row, which is going to have the majority of our design. So let's go ahead and click this plus button here. Right, so our row structure is going to be this one right here. I'm going to go ahead and select it. And before we do anything here, let's add a background color. So I'm going to click here on my row settings, click on background, and our background color here is going to be white. Now let's make this row full width. So I'm going to click here on design, sizing, So we're going to drag this until it's 100%, and our max width here is also going to be 100%. Now on the gutter width, we're going to make sure that we don't have any spaces between the columns. So let's set this to 1. And now let's head over to the spacing and add our margins and our padding. So I'm going to click here on spacing, and the first thing we're going to do is to add our top margin. So our top margin here is going to be 2 VW, and it's going to be the same value for the top and the bottom. Now for the top and bottom padding, we're going to set this to 10 VW. Now let's add these values for the other devices. So I'm going to start off with the tablet. So over here, it's going to be 10 VW as well. And for the phone, we're also going to set this to 10 VW. So for the desktop here, this needs to be set to 5 because initially I had it at 10 VW. So just double check and make sure that you have your values right. And again, as you can see here for the phone, for some reason it hasn't updated. So let's go and update this. All right, so now that we have all our values here for the tablet, phone, and the desktop, the next thing we need to do is to add our padding. So let's start here with our left and right padding. So here we're going to set it on the phone to begin with. So over here it's going to be 2 VW. Now let's move over to the tablet. And again, this is going to be 2 VW. And then for the desktop, it's going to be 20 VW. Right, so let's move on and add our box shadow. So I'm going to click here on box shadow. And the style we're going to go with is this one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. And we're also going to add a blur strength and the shadow color. So I'm going to come over here, set this to 50. And then I'm going to add my color, paste my color between the brackets. And as we did before, we need our columns next to each other. So we're going to add the CSS code here. So I'm going to come to custom CSS, main element, and then I'm going to paste my flex value. All right, so that's all we need to do for this section. So the next thing we need to do now is to add a blurb module. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Scroll down, click here on this plus button and add our blurb. Now we don't need this text, so I'm going to get rid of it. And we also don't need this title. So again, I'm going to get rid of the title. All we need here is the icon. So go to image and icon and click on use icon. So over here, you can choose any icon you want. So I'm just going to choose this folder icon. Now let's add a gradient to the background. So I'm going to click here on background, click the second tab, click this plus button and add my first color for my gradient. Add it. And then we're also going to add our second color. I'm going to paste it here. Now, as I mentioned before, if you want to use the exact same colors, go ahead and click on the link, which will lead you to the post in the show notes below. So our gradient direction here is 142. Now let's head over to the icon settings. So I'm going to click here on design, image and icon. So the first thing we're going to do is to add our icon color. So I'm going to make it white, and the icon placement, make sure it's set to top. But over here, we want to adjust the size of this icon. So I'm going to say use icon font size. And then I am going to start adding my sizes. So for my desktop, it's going to be set to 4 VW. And then now let's click on this little icon here and add our values for the phone and the tablet. For the phone and tablet, we're going to set this to 4 VW. Come over here, and there we go. So we have our sizes now. Now let's go to the sizing tab. So over here, we need to set our sizing settings to 78 for the desktop and 48 for the tablet and phone. So we're going to set here our width at 48%, and for the desktop. All right, so for the next stage now is to adjust the width of our icon here. So we're going to come over here to sizing and make sure that we go to width. So we're going to start off with the phone and make sure that this is set to 48%. And for the tablet, it also needs to be 48. And for the desktop, this needs to be set to 78. Okay, so far this is what it looks like. Now let's move on to the spacing. So we need to add some margins. So this 2 VW needs to be added just to the phone. So let's come over here to spacing. So for the margin here, we're going to set it to top margin, but it's going to be on the mobile phone. So I'm going to come over here, set this to 2 VW. Now it's time to add the padding. So for the padding here, top, this needs to be on the phone. So make sure you set this to 8.5 VW. For the tablet, this needs to be set to 9. And then for the desktop, we're going to set this to 6 VW. Now let's add the bottom padding. So since we are here on the desktop tab, let's go ahead and add our values. So this is going to be 4VW. Let's move on to the tablet tab. Now over here, we're going to set this to 5. And for the phone, we're going to set it to 3VW. So we need to come up with a design here which shows this as a perfect circle. So in order to do that, we need to go to border and add 100 VW here at the top. And now you can see we have a perfect circle. Now, as I mentioned before, you do need to make sure that this chain icon is activated, because if you don't, these values will only be applied to one side of these corners. All right, so now that we have this perfect circle, now let's go ahead and add a box shadow. So I'm going to scroll down here to box shadow. And the one I'm going to go with is this one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. And we also need to add a vertical and shadow strength. So our vertical position is going to be 10 pixels. So I'm going to set it here. Now let's add our spread strength. And again, this is going to be 5 pixels. And then finally, we are going to add our color. So this color is going to be an RGBA value. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and just make sure you add your values between these brackets, just like that. Okay, so now we have this nice little blend, and that's looking great. All right, so what we're going to do next now is to add a text module. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to save this. Then I'm going to click here and add our text module. So I'm going to search for it first, select it. So we're going to start by adding a heading. So I'm going to highlight all this, get rid of it, and just add my heading text, highlight it, make sure it's set to heading 3. Now let's go ahead and customize this. So I'm going to click here on design, heading text, heading 3. So the first thing we're going to do is to change this to pop-ins. And now let's add our sizes. So for the desktop, it's going to be 2VW. Now I'm going to click this little tab icon and then go into the tablet tab. And for the tablet, we're going to set this to 3VW. And for the phone, we're going to set it to 4VW. Now let's add some spacing, and so we're going to add some top and bottom margins as well as padding. So let's start here with going to spacing. So we're going to add our top margin here, but this is going to be for the desktop and tablet. So over here for the desktop and tablet, we're going to set this to 3VW. And for the phone, we're going to set this to 0VW. Now we're going to add a left margin for our phone and tablet. So since we're on the phone tab here, you might as well go ahead and add it here. So that's going to be -20. And then for the tablet, it's again going to be -20. But on the desktop, we're going to set this to 0VW. Now for the bottom padding, we're going to set this to 1VW for the desktop. Now we're going to click this little icon here and add different values for our tablet and our phone. So I'm going to click on the tablet tab, and here it's going to be 2VW as well as the phone. Now make sure you're keeping an eye on your design here as you're doing this, because it might be off visually. So you just need to make sure you're on the right tab and you're adding the right values. All right, so that's looking great. So the next thing we're going to do now is to add a border. So we're going to scroll down here, click on border. So our border here is going to be on the left. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. Our border width is going to be 5 pixels. And we're also going to add a border color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool. I'm going to add my very light gray color in here and add our border style. So right now it's set to solid, and this is the default value. But this time we want this to be double, and then we're going to save. Right, so the next thing we're going to do now is to add a divider to column 2. So I'm going to click here on this plus button, search for my divider module, select it, click on design. So first of all, let's add our color. So I'm going to paste my color in here. And as you can see, this divider color here is pretty much the same as the left border that I added there. Okay, so next we're going to come over here to styles. So this is set to solid. Let's set it to double. Now let's head over to sizing, and for our weight, we're going to set this to 5, because what we're trying to do here is to match it with what we have here on the left border. Okay, and then for the height, we're going to set this to 0. Now let's head over here to spacing. So for the spacing, we are going to add a left margin on the desktop of 20 VW. And then while we're here, we might as well add our values for our phone and tablet. In fact, this needs to be 0 for the desktop. Right, so I'm going to click here on this little icon, go to the tablet, and for the tablet, this needs to be set to 20. So as you can see, as I'm entering these values, things are moving here on the screen. So over here on the phone, again, this needs to be set to 20. So I'm just going to add that. Okay, so that's looking great now. We have this L shape here with our borders. All right, so the next thing we need to do now is to add a text module, and this is just going to be some dummy text. So I'm going to save here, and then we're going to click this plus button and add a text module. I'm going to select that. I'm going to paste my dummy text in here. Now let's add our sizes for our text. So I'm going to come over here to design, text. So let's start with the size on the desktop. So it's going to be 0.8 VW. I'm going to click here on this little icon and then go into the tablet view. Now on the tablet, this is going to be 1.7 VW. So I'm going to make sure I add my values in here. And for the phone, we are going to set this at 2 VW. Right, so now that we have all our sizes for our 3 devices, next we need to just make sure our text orientation is set to left. Now we're going to play around with the spacing values as well. So I'm going to click here on spacing. So here we're going to start with the top margin. So anyway, here we're just going to leave it at 0 VW. And then left margin here is going to be set at -20. Now this is going to be for the phone and the tablet, because here on the desktop, our left margin here just needs to be set to 0 VW. Right, so I'm going to click on this little icon here and just add my value here, -20 VW. And for the tablet, again, it's going to be -20. All right, so that's looking great. The next stage now is to add my top and bottom padding. So again, I am going to start with my tablets. So over here on my tablet, I'm going to make sure that I add my top padding here of 3 VW. So as you can see, as I'm adding these values, now I'm getting some breathing space here on my text because it was a bit too close to the borderline there. Okay, so that's for the phone and the tablet. So in fact, let me go in and add this for my phone as well. So that's going to be 3 VW as well. Now for the tablet, we're going to set this to 2 VW. So let's just scroll down here and make sure everything's in place. Okay, so this needs to be 2 VW. Okay, so as you can see, that has just moved up just a little bit. Right, so for the left padding, so we've just done this on the top padding. So let's work on the left padding now. So again, since we're on the desktop tab, let's add 2 VW here on the top, on the desktop. Right, so now for the tablets, we're going to set this to 5 VW. Okay, and then on the phone, again, this is going to be 5 VW. Right, so it looks like our spacing is looking great. Right, the next step now is to add a button onto this column here. So I'm going to click on this plus button and add my button module. So in this button here, we can add any text we want. So in this case, I'm going to add read more. Now we need to stylize our button. So to do that, we need to come over here to the design tab, click on button, and then use custom styles for button. So the first thing we're going to do here is to add a button text color. So I'm going to come over here, click on this eyedropper tool and paste my color in here. Just like that. Right, so our border width here is going to be, in fact, before we talk about the border width and all of that, why don't we add the sizes of our button? So I'm going to start here with our text. So I'm going to click here on button text size. We're going to set this to 1 VW. And we're also going to add our sizes for the tablet and the phone. And to do that, I'm going to click here on this little icon, click on the tablet. And for our tablet here, we're going to set this to 2 VW. And then for the phone, we're going to set this to 2.5 VW. Right, so now that we have all our sizes for the button, the next stage now is to add our border width. So at the moment, it's set here to 2 pixels. So let's set this to 1 because the 2 is comes in by default. Okay, so now that we have this, we also need to make sure that our border color here matches our text color. So I'm going to click here on this eyedropper tool and paste my color here for the border. Okay, great. So moving on, what we're going to do now is we're going to add a border radius of 1 pixel as well. So by default here, as you can see, it's set to 3. I'm going to set this to 1. And then we're also going to change our font to Poppins. So this is going to just make sure that everything is consistent. Okay, so now that we have our button, the next stage now is to also go to our spacing, because as you can see here, the button here is not correctly positioned. So we're going to go into our spacing and add our top margin, because we need to add some space between our paragraph here and the button. So I'm going to scroll down here to spacing, and for our top margin here, we're going to set this to 4VW, but in fact, this 4VW needs to be for the tablet and phone. So here we need to set it to 2VW. All right, so let's go on now to the other views. So I'm going to click here on tablet, and here is where we need to set it to 4VW. Okay, we're going to do the same to the phone as well. So I'm going to click here on the phone, set this to 4VW. All right, great. So while we're on that tab, we're also going to add a left margin because the positioning of it is not correct. So we're going to come over here to our margins. So I'm going to add a left margin of -20. And as you can see here, my button now has moved closer to the left. We're going to come over here to the tablet, do the same thing, -20. And for the desktop, we're going to set it to 0VW. Right, so now that we have all the elements that we need for this design, we are going to clone this twice. So I'm just going to scroll down here and clone this twice. Okay, so now that I've cloned it twice, the next thing now is to just change the icons and change the colors as well. So I'm going to go into this second one here and change the icon. So I'm going to click here on image and icon and just drag this down and choose my icon. So I'm going to go with, let's go with this one here. Okay, now the next stage is to change the colors. So we're just going to change the gradient colors. So I'm going to click here on background, click on the first color here and paste my color here in place. And then we're also going to add the second color. So I'm going to click here and paste my color in here, just like that. And then what you may also want to do is to go in and change the colors of the shadow that we have here. So I'm going to click here on design, and then I'm going to go to box shadow, select my shadow here, and then I'm just going to add a color to go with that. Now, what you could also do here with the colors here, just make sure that you choose a color that works with the colors that you choose here in the gradient. So I'm going to go ahead now and save. Now we're going to move on to the next item. So I'm going to scroll down here, click here on this gear icon, image and icon, and now let's change our icon for this. So for this icon, I'm just going to go with, I'm just going to go with this icon here. Okay, so let's go to the background now and change our colors. So I'm going to add my first color in here, add my second color, and then we're also going to come over here to design, box shadow, choose my shadow color, and then I'm just going to go with a color that just works with that, and we're going to add a bit of transparency to it. Okay, all right, so that's looking good. So we're going to save. Now the next stage is to change the text color and the button border color as well. So to do that, I'm just going to come over here, click this gear icon, and then I'm going to go into my text here, click on button. So first of all, I'm going to add my text color. I'm going to paste it in here, and then I'm going to go ahead now and also add my color there. So now you can see that my color now has been updated. So the idea here is to just make sure that we match this button here with our design that we have on the top here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do and change the colors to the last button as well. So I'm going to go in, click on the gear icon, design, button, and then we're going to add our text color, and we're also going to add our border width or our border color, paste my color in here. So pretty much this is our final design. So let's take a look at this in the three views. So we're going to take a look at the tablet view and also the phone view. All right, so let's save this. So as you can see here, this is looking great on this view. Now let's take a look at the phone view. Now even that looks really nice.
So there you have it. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and do follow us on our social media platforms. By doing so, you'll be notified every time we release new tutorials. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.